Now that we've made this wonderful pastry dough, we're going to make a cherry pie with it, a lattice cherry pie, which I think is really the prettiest, so you can see the bright red berries through the lattice. First of all, the thing to consider is what kind of pie pan. This is an old-fashioned pie pan that has little holes in it, and that is what makes it a crisp bottom crust. There are several secrets to making a crisp bottom crust when you put juicy things into a pie. One of them is the pie pan. This is a black pie pan. Black absorbs heat, and it makes the pie crust crisper. Glass is also a good choice because you can see how it's browning through the glass, and in addition to that, it tends to make a browner crust. The pans to stay away from are really shiny metal that reflect away the heat from the pie. So I'm starting with a pie dough that we took out of the refrigerator that has been chilling for 1 hour and is now just the perfect consistency to roll out. If you've kept it in for 6 hours, take out the dough and let it sit for about 15 minutes or until it's nice and malleable. Now what I have here is a pastry cloth. And the ideal thing about a pastry cloth is just a piece of muslin. And you don't need a frame necessarily, but it certainly makes rolling easier. This can be found in any hardware store. And what you do is you rub the flour into it, and the dough only picks up as much flour as it absolutely needs to have. It comes, as a matter of fact, with a pastry sleeve, so I also rub some flour into the sleeve, and that way the dough doesn't stick at all. Now, of course, if you don't have a pastry cloth, you can roll your dough out between plastic wrap or wax paper, or you can just heavily flour the counter, and then it won't stick either. But I think that it's a good idea to use one of these systems other than flouring the counter, because if you have too much flour worked into the dough, what happens is that the dough gets tough and dry. On these pastry cloths, there are marks, rings, that tell you at what point to stop rolling. And the first ring is for an 8-inch pie. This is a 9-inch pie plate, so we're rolling to a 9-inch. And actually, the 9-inch mark gives you a 12-inch diameter, because you're going to want to have excess to have that nice, beautiful side crust. You know how pies in magazines always look so magnificent, and then you make it and it turns out to be kind of rough and homespun? Nothing wrong with that. I mean, it looks very inviting to eat. But there are ways to make the pie crust come out as beautiful looking as it does in pictures. And some of it is in the rolling, but a lot of it is in the chilling. So I'm going to show you how to make a very attractive side crust. Now you'll see, if I were rolling it out on just a plain surface, I would have to check and make sure that it wasn't sticking and add more flour. But here you can see I have plenty of flour and not too much. So I'm going to be rolling it out about 1/4 of an inch thick, and then placing it in the pie pan and preparing my filling. Now if it's a warm day and it seems like the crust is getting rather warm, you can just take the crust and refrigerate it until your filling is ready. But it's only a matter of seconds to make the filling. Now what I've chosen here are canned cherries. You can see because they're not quite as bright as fresh picked cherries. But we're going to brighten their color with a little food coloring. It takes very little, and you can omit that if you prefer not to use it. Okay, now there are many ways to transfer. I'm going to use the glass pie plate now. There are many ways to transfer pie dough. You can fold it in quarters, which I will do later, and you can also wrap it around the rolling pin. So I'm just rolling it around, and you see the pie dough is going to be very flaky and tender, but it's elastic enough so that it doesn't tear when I lift it. And I ease it in. If it should tear, you can adjust it. You can just patch it with a piece of spare dough. There's always extra dough left over. But you'll notice I'm avoiding stretching it. I'm just easing it down into the sides, because if I don't do that, it will start shrinking on its own after it bakes. And pressing it in. And then I'm going to trim, and actually a scissors is the ideal thing to use for this. I'm going to trim some of the excess lip, about 1/2 inch away from the side of the pan. Now, if you're lucky enough to be able to get tart, fresh cherries, I think there's nothing more delicious in this world. And you can freeze the cherries. They even freeze well for 2 years. I will explain as I'm doing the cherry filling how to convert this to a fresh cherry pie, because using canned cherries is slightly different. The one problem with cherries is the pits, and when you buy canned cherries, sometimes a pit slips through the mechanical pitting machine. So it always says on the can little warnings about checking and making sure. When you pit the cherries yourself, there's a special system that you can use to ensure that not a single pit remains and that the cherries stay bright and plump. And that is an old-fashioned hairpin. They're sometimes a little bit difficult to find. Heavy duty is better. And all those fancy cherry pitting machines, not a single one works as well as this little system. What you do is you take the looped end of the hairpin and you insert it into the cherry. Now I'm just faking this because these have been pitted, presumably by machine. And you put it in, and then you just lift the pit out. And it's infallible. That way you can be sure that you have gotten every pit out of every cherry. Okay, now that I have this bottom crust ready, I'm going to not do the top lattice until I fill the pie. Obviously, I can't put the lattice on until the pie filling is in. So let me just move this slightly aside, get rid of my extra scraps, and you can freeze these and use them for little individual tarts sometimes when the fresh berry season is around. It's nice to have extra pie crust. What I've done is I've taken 2 1-pound cans of tart red cherries packed in water, and I've drained them with a strainer for at least an hour to make sure all the water is out. That's the only way to control how thick the filling of your pie is going to be. And I've thrown away all but 1 cup, 1 liquid cup of the cherry juice. I like to use tapioca instead of cornstarch because sometimes the acidity of the cherries makes the cornstarch not work quite as well, and the thickness of the filling varies. So I'm adding 1/4 cup of tapioca, that's the quick cooking tapioca, to my cherry juice. And I'm going to add a pinch of salt. That will help dissolve it evenly. And then 1 cup of sugar, which can be added to the cherries. Now, if you like, you can use only 3/4 cup of sugar and use a cherry wine, which is sweet, for 3/4 cup of the liquid, and use just 1 cup of the cherry juice. So I'm mixing this together and just stirring in the cherry juice. Make sure all the tapioca gets in because that's what thickens it. Now, if I were using fresh cherries, I would use 20 ounces of pitted cherries, and that comes to 3½ cups, which is exactly the same amount of cherries that are in the can after it's drained. And I would only use 3/4 cup or 13 tablespoons maximum of sugar because I'm using much less juice. The only juice I'm using is the natural juice that's exuded by the cherries. So with fresh cherries, you have to let it sit with the sugar in order to get some liquid to form. Now this is a bit of almond extract, 1/8 teaspoon of food color and 1/4 teaspoon of almond extract. There's something about almond that enhances the flavor of cherries, and rather than tasting almond, it simply tastes more like cherry. Okay, this filling now gets poured into the pie shell. Make sure to use all of it because the tapioca is what's going to thicken it.